The baby's screams tore through the stagecoach like a wounded animal, raw, relentless, unstoppable. For 3 days, passengers had endured it. The cowboy holding the infant looked like a man watching his world collapse. Powerless against cries no bottle could silence, no rocking could soothe. Then the widow across from him did something that made every jaw drop and every breath catch. What happened next on that dusty Colorado trail would break every rule of propriety and save 3 lives forever. If you're drawn to stories of impossible choices and unexpected redemption, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. The Colorado Plains stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast expanse of amber grassland broken only by occasional clusters of cottonwood trees and the deep ruts carved by countless wagon wheels. The stagecoach lurched over the uneven terrain, its wooden frame creaking in protest with each jolt. Inside, 6 passengers sat in various states of discomfort, their bodies swaying with the rhythm of the wheels, their faces marked by dust and exhaustion. But it wasn't the rough journey that had pushed them to the edge of endurance. It was the crying. The infant's wails filled every inch of the coach's interior, bouncing off the leather walls, drilling into skulls, fraying nerves that had already worn thin over 3 brutal days of travel. The sound was primal, desperate, the kind of crying that signaled something more than mere discomfort. This was a baby in distress, and everyone knew it. Caleb Warren held the child against his chest, his large, calloused hands supporting the tiny body with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his appearance. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and sun-weathered, with hands that had branded cattle, built fences, and broken the noses of men who'd tried to steal his land. But those same hands trembled now as they cradled the squirming infant. "Please," he whispered, his voice hoarse from 3 days of pleading. "Please, son, please." The baby, barely 3 weeks old, only screamed harder, his face turning an alarming shade of red, his tiny fists clenched against his father's shirt. Across from Caleb, a traveling salesman named Pritchard pressed his fingers against his temples, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles jumped beneath his skin. He'd stopped making sympathetic noises on the second day. Now he just stared out the window, willing the miles to pass faster. Beside him, Mrs. Henderson, a Presbyterian minister's wife traveling to Denver, had her eyes closed in either prayer or an attempt to mentally escape the confines of the coach. Her lips moved silently, and Caleb couldn't tell if she was asking for divine intervention or simply counting the hours until this journey ended. The other 2 passengers, a young mining engineer and an older gentleman in a weathered suit, had retreated into themselves, their expressions blank, defeated. Then there was the woman. She sat in the corner opposite Caleb, pressed against the side of the coach, as if trying to make herself as small as possible. Eliza Moore had barely spoken since boarding in Julesburg 3 days prior. She was perhaps 30, though grief had a way of aging a person that had nothing to do with years. Her dark hair was pulled back beneath a simple bonnet, her traveling dress a deep gray that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced, knuckles white. But it was her eyes that told the real story. They were the eyes of someone who had looked directly at devastation and survived, but only barely. Caleb had seen that look before, in men who'd come back from war, in women who'd buried children, in anyone who'd stared into an abyss and felt it stare back. She watched the baby with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite articulate why. Every time Samuel, the baby's name was Samuel after Caleb's grandfather, let out a particularly desperate wail, something flickered across her face. Pain, yes, but something else, too. Recognition, perhaps. Or memory. "How much longer?" Pritchard asked, not bothering to hide his irritation. "Fort Collins is still half a day out," the driver had called down during their last stop. That was 2 hours ago, which meant they had at least 4 more hours of this. 4 more hours of Samuel's cries, 4 more hours of Caleb's failure, playing out in front of strangers. He'd tried everything. The bottle with the milk he'd purchased from a dairy farmer at their last stop was barely touched. Samuel would take a few desperate sucks before turning his head away, screaming even louder. Caleb had changed the cloth diaper 3 times, checked for pins that might be poking tender skin, rocked the baby until his arms ached. Nothing worked. Nothing had worked since Margaret died. The thought of his wife sent a fresh wave of pain through his chest, and Caleb forced it down. He couldn't afford to fall apart. Not here, not in front of these people. He was Caleb Warren, owner of the largest ranch in Weld County, a man who'd built an empire from nothing, who'd faced down claim jumpers and drought and cattle thieves. He'd survived the death of his parents, the betrayal of his brother, the harsh winters that had killed half his herd in '71. But this tiny human, barely 7 pounds of flesh and bone, had defeated him completely. "Try the bottle again, Mrs." Henderson said without opening her eyes. Her voice was clipped, carrying an edge that suggested her patience had limits, and they were rapidly approaching them. "He won't take it," Caleb replied. But he shifted Samuel in his arms anyway, reaching for the bottle that sat on the bench beside him. The milk had gone slightly sour in the heat, but it was all he had. Samuel's mouth found the rubber nipple, sucked twice, then turned away with a wail that seemed to vibrate the very air. A thin stream of milk dribbled down his chin, mixing with the tears that streaked his impossibly small face. "Jesus Christ," Pritchard muttered, earning a sharp look from Mrs. Henderson. Caleb wanted to defend himself, to explain that he was doing everything he could, that he hadn't slept more than an hour at a time in 3 weeks, that he was drowning in grief and terror and a responsibility he'd never asked for. But what would be the point? These people didn't care about his circumstances. They just wanted the crying to stop. He wanted the crying to stop, but more than that, he wanted Samuel to be okay. The baby had lost weight since Margaret's death. Caleb could feel it in how the infant's clothes hung loose and how his tiny ribs were too prominent beneath the thin fabric of his gown. He was getting weaker, and Caleb knew it. The wet nurse in Denver had been a disaster. Samuel had refused to feed, and the woman had made it clear she had 3 other infants to care for and couldn't waste time on a difficult baby. So Caleb had taken him, along with a dozen bottles and instructions he couldn't follow, and started the journey back to his ranch outside Fort Collins. He thought the trip would be simple. 3 days by stagecoach, then home where his housekeeper could help, where he could find another wet nurse, where he could figure out how to keep this tiny, screaming piece of Margaret alive. But Samuel was fading, and everyone in this coach knew it. The baby's cries had changed over the past hour. They were weaker now, more desperate. The pauses between screams grew longer, and during those pauses, Samuel made soft, plaintive sounds that cut deeper than any wail. He was exhausted, starving, giving up. Caleb felt panic rising in his throat like bile. The stagecoach hit a particularly deep rut, and everyone lurched to the side. Samuel's bottle fell from Caleb's grip, hit the floor, and rolled beneath the opposite bench. The remaining milk spilled across the floorboards in a thin, yellowish stream. "Damn it," Caleb breathed. "Language," Mrs. Henderson said automatically, though her heart clearly wasn't in the rebuke. Caleb ignored her. He shifted Samuel to one arm and bent forward, reaching for the bottle. His fingers brushed the glass just as the coach lurched again, and the bottle rolled farther away, coming to rest against the hem of Eliza Moore's gray dress. She didn't move. Caleb looked up at her, ready to ask her to pass the bottle back to him, but the words died in his throat. She was staring at Samuel with an expression of such raw, visceral pain that Caleb actually flinched. Her face had gone pale, her lips slightly parted, her hands gripping the edge of the bench with enough force that her knuckles had gone bone white. She looked like a woman watching her own execution. "Ma'am," Caleb said softly. Eliza's eyes snapped to his face, and for just a moment, he saw everything she'd been hiding for 3 days. The grief was staggering, a weight so heavy it should have crushed her. But beneath it, he saw something else. A flicker of... what? Longing? Desperation? Then her expression smoothed over, and she looked away out the window at the passing landscape. "Ma'am, if you could just..." Caleb gestured toward the bottle at her feet. She bent down slowly, almost mechanically, and picked up the bottle. But instead of handing it back to him, she just held it, staring at the dregs of spoiled milk that remained. "It's gone bad," she said. Her voice was quiet, roughened by disuse. It was the first time she'd spoken in hours. "I know," Caleb said, "but it's all I have until we reach Fort Collins." "He won't drink it." It wasn't a question. "No." Eliza continued to stare at the bottle. Samuel's cries had diminished to soft, hitching sobs now, each one sounding more defeated than the last. The sound seemed to physically hurt her. Caleb watched her flinch with each tiny gasp. "How old is he?" she asked. 3 weeks. 3 weeks and 2 days. And his mother? The question landed like a punch. Caleb's throat tightened. "She died. Complications from the birth. He's all I have left of her." Something cracked in Eliza's carefully controlled expression. She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, they were glassy with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The stagecoach rolled on, wheels grinding against stone and dirt, carrying them all toward Fort Collins and whatever waited there. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the plains in shades of gold and amber. It would have been beautiful if anyone had been in the state of mind to notice. Caleb took the bottle from Eliza's hand, or rather, she released it to him without quite handing it over, and set it aside. There was no point in trying again. He adjusted Samuel against his shoulder, one hand supporting the baby's head, the other rubbing small circles on his back. It was a gesture he'd seen Margaret do 1,000 times during her pregnancy, practicing on her own stomach, talking to their unborn son about all the love that waited for him. If she could see him now, fumbling and failing, would she be disappointed? Or would she understand that he was doing his best with knowledge he didn't have and skills he'd never developed? "Miss Warren," Mrs. Henderson said, and there was something different in her tone now. Less irritation, more genuine concern. "That child needs proper nourishment. Cow's milk isn't sufficient for an infant this young. Surely you know that." "I know," Caleb said tightly. "I'm trying to get him to a wet nurse. There's one in Fort Collins, a woman who—" "Will he make it that long?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Caleb looked down at Samuel's face. The baby's eyes were half closed, his crying reduced to weak mewling sounds. His skin looked wrong, too pale, too thin, stretched over bones that seemed too prominent. When had he last had a proper feeding? Yesterday morning? The day before? Time had become a blur of sleepless hours and constant motion. "He has to," Caleb said, but even he could hear the doubt in his own voice. Pritchard shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the turn in conversation. The mining engineer studied his hands. The older gentleman continued to stare out the window as if none of this concerned him. But Eliza was looking at the baby again, and this time Caleb saw something new in her expression. A war was playing out behind her eyes. Something fighting against something else, need battling against fear, impulse struggling with restraint. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it, opened it again, closed it. Her breathing had quickened, her chest rising and falling rapidly beneath the high collar of her dress. "Ma'am?" Caleb said. "Are you all right?" She didn't answer. Instead, she did something that shocked everyone in the coach into absolute stillness. She stood. In the confined space of the stagecoach, with the floor lurching and swaying beneath her feet, Eliza Moore rose from her seat and took the 2 steps that separated her bench from Caleb's. She stood directly in front of him, looking down at Samuel with an expression that mixed anguish with something that might have been determination. "Give him to me," she said. Caleb stared at her. "What?" "Give him to me," she repeated, and her voice was stronger now, clearer. "Please. I don't understand." Eliza's hands were shaking. She clasped them together in front of her body, then released them, then clasped them again. "I can help him, but you have to give him to me, and you have to trust me." Mrs. Henderson sat forward. "Now, just a minute. I can feed him," Eliza said, cutting her off. She wasn't looking at Mrs. Henderson. She was looking at Caleb, and in her eyes was a desperate plea that needed no words. "Properly. The way he needs. But we'll need privacy, and you cannot ask questions. Do you understand?" The implication hit Caleb like a physical blow. Around them, the other passengers began to understand as well. Mrs. Henderson's mouth fell open in shock. Pritchard turned bright red and suddenly became very interested in the coach's ceiling. The mining engineer coughed awkwardly. "You can't be serious," Mrs. Henderson breathed. That's completely inappropriate. Unseemly. You're not his mother, you're not his wet nurse, you're a stranger, and I buried my daughter 4 months ago, Eliza said, and her voice cut through Mrs. Henderson's objections like a knife. 4 months ago, I held her in my arms and felt her take her last breath. She was 6 weeks old, and my body— She paused, swallowed hard. My body hasn't forgotten how to feed a child. Silence crashed over the coach like a wave. Caleb looked down at Samuel, at the weak, pitiful sounds coming from his son's mouth, at the hollowness in his cheeks and the way his tiny fingers clutched weakly at air. He thought about Margaret's last words, whispered through cracked lips in a room that smelled of blood and death. Keep him safe. Please, Caleb. Promise me you'll keep him safe. He'd promised, and he was failing. What do you need? He asked. Mrs. Henderson made a sound of protest. Mr. Warren, you cannot possibly be considering— What do you need? Caleb repeated, looking at Eliza. The curtain, she said, nodding toward the leather shade that could be pulled down over the window. Privacy and silence. Just give me 20 minutes. Caleb stood carefully, cradling Samuel against his chest. The baby's crying had stopped entirely now, replaced by soft, gasping sounds that terrified him more than any scream. He looked at Eliza's face, at the grief and determination warring there, at the tears that had finally spilled over to track down her cheeks. Are you sure? He asked quietly, so only she could hear. No, she whispered back. But he's dying, Mr. Warren. We both know it. And I can't watch another baby die. I can't. Not if there's something I can do to stop it. Caleb extended his arms, offering Samuel to her. For a moment, Eliza hesitated, her hands hovering in the space between them. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, she took the baby. The moment Samuel was in her arms, something changed. The infant seemed to sense it too. His weak crying paused, and he turned his head instinctively, rooting against the fabric of her dress. Eliza made a small, broken sound and pulled him closer. The curtain, she said again. Caleb moved quickly, pulling down the leather shades on both windows on Eliza's side of the coach, plunging that half of the interior into shadow. Mrs. Henderson was saying something about propriety and scandal, but Caleb ignored her. He shrugged out of his duster and held it up, creating a makeshift barrier between Eliza and the rest of the passengers. 20 minutes, he said. Take what you need. Eliza nodded, already sinking back onto her bench, already turning away to position the baby. Through the fabric of his coat, Caleb could see her shadow moving, adjusting, preparing. Then Samuel made a sound, not a cry, but a small noise of surprise followed immediately by silence. Profound, blessed silence. The kind of silence that followed desperate need finally being met. Caleb held the coat steady, creating a wall between Eliza and the other passengers, and listened to the sound of his son feeding for the first time in days. The soft, rhythmic sounds of suckling mixed with tiny, satisfied squeaks. He could hear Eliza's breathing too, shaky at first, then steadying, then hitching again with what he knew were tears. Behind him, Mrs. Henderson had finally fallen silent. The other passengers sat frozen, uncertain how to process what was happening. Only the steady rhythm of the coach wheels on packed earth continued, carrying them all forward into territory none of them had anticipated. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. Caleb's arms ached from holding the coat, but he didn't lower it. He stood there, a living wall, protecting something sacred and strange and utterly necessary. The sun continued its descent outside the curtained windows, painting the world in shades of orange and red that none of them could see. At 20 minutes, Eliza spoke softly. Mr. Warren? Yes? He's asleep, fed and asleep. Caleb lowered the coat slowly. Eliza sat in the shadowed corner of the coach, Samuel cradled against her shoulder, one hand supporting his head. The baby's face was peaceful, truly peaceful, for the first time since they'd boarded. His mouth was slightly open, his breathing deep and even. Color had returned to his cheeks. Eliza's face was wet with tears, but she was smiling, a sad, broken smile that somehow contained gratitude and grief in equal measure. He took to it well, she said softly. He was so hungry. I know, Caleb said. I know. I didn't know how to— It's not your fault. She looked down at Samuel, and her expression softened further. He's beautiful. He has your chin. Margaret's eyes, though. Yes, I can see that. Caleb sat down slowly on the bench across from her, his legs suddenly weak. The relief that flooded through him was so intense it was almost painful. Samuel was fed. Samuel was sleeping. Samuel was alive. And for the first time in 3 weeks, Caleb could breathe without feeling like his chest was being crushed. The other passengers had still not spoken. Mrs. Henderson was looking out the window, her expression inscrutable. Pritchard had pulled out a newspaper and was pretending to read it, though his eyes weren't moving. The other two had simply closed their eyes, either sleeping or pretending to sleep. Mrs. Moore, Caleb said quietly, I don't know how to thank you. Don't, Eliza replied. Please don't. I didn't do it for thanks. Then why? She was quiet for a long moment, just looking at the sleeping baby in her arms. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because he needed me. And She paused, swallowed. I needed to be needed. Just one more time. The stagecoach rolled on as the sun sank lower in the western sky. Inside, the silence that had been broken by Samuel's cries for 3 days was now broken by something else. A fragile, uncertain peace built on an act that broke every social convention but answered a desperate biological truth. Caleb watched Eliza hold his son, watched her rock him gently with movements that were clearly muscle memory from her own lost child, and felt something shift in his chest. Gratitude, yes. Relief, absolutely. But something else too. A recognition that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet understand. That this woman, this stranger with her own ocean of grief, had just become essential to his son's survival. And that when they reached Fort Collins in a few hours, he was going to have to make a choice that would either save Samuel's life or destroy what remained of Caleb's carefully controlled world. The sun touched the horizon, and the planes turned to fire. Inside the stagecoach, a baby slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. And 2 broken people sat in the gathering darkness, bound together by an act of mercy that had required everything from one of them and cost the other a piece of her soul she'd thought she'd lost forever. Outside, Fort Collins waited. Inside, the future was being written in ways none of them could predict. But for now, in this moment, there was silence. And sometimes, silence was everything. The stagecoach rolled into Fort Collins just as the last light drained from the western sky, leaving the town bathed in the purple blue of twilight. Lanterns flickered to life in windows along the main street, casting warm pools of yellow light onto the dusty thoroughfare. The driver pulled the team to a halt outside the Wells Fargo office, the horses snorting and stamping, glad to be done with the day's journey. Inside the coach, no one moved immediately. The past 4 hours had passed in a strange, suspended quiet, broken only by the rhythmic creaking of the wheels and Samuel's occasional soft sounds of contentment. Twice more, Eliza had fed him behind the makeshift curtain of Caleb's coat, and each time the baby had nursed eagerly before falling back into deep, peaceful sleep. Now, as the other passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark, Caleb found himself paralyzed by a choice he'd been avoiding for the last 100 miles. Eliza still held Samuel, who was awake now but calm, his dark eyes watching the shadows dance across the coach's ceiling. She had one hand beneath his head, the other resting protectively across his small body. In the dim light filtering through the coach's windows, she looked like a Madonna from one of those paintings Caleb had seen in a Denver gallery once, serene, sorrowful, impossibly beautiful in her grief. "Well," Mrs. Henderson said, breaking the silence as she adjusted her bonnet, "I certainly hope everyone here understands the importance of discretion regarding today's irregularities." She looked pointedly at each passenger in turn. "What occurred was highly unusual, but given the circumstances, I trust we can all agree to keep our observations to ourselves." Pritchard nodded quickly, clearly eager to put the whole uncomfortable situation behind him. "Haven't seen a thing worth mentioning, ma'am. Just a long, uneventful journey." The mining engineer and the older gentleman murmured similar agreements, already moving toward the door. Mrs. Henderson gave Eliza one last, complicated look, disapproval mixed with something that might have been grudging respect, before gathering her skirts and stepping down from the coach. Then it was just the 3 of them. Caleb cleared his throat. Mrs. Moore, You should take him, Eliza said quickly, extending Samuel toward him. You'll want to get him settled for the night. Caleb took his son carefully, cradling the baby against his chest. Samuel made a small sound of protest at being moved, but didn't cry. The difference from this morning was staggering. This was a content-fed infant, not the desperate, starving creature who'd screamed himself hoarse for 3 days. Where are you staying tonight? Caleb asked. Eliza gathered her small traveling bag and stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that weren't quite steady. The hotel, I suppose. The Colorado house, if they have rooms available. And then? She paused, one hand on the coach door. I have a ticket on tomorrow's stage to Denver. I have arrangements there. A position as a seamstress with a dress shop. It's all settled. Caleb should have nodded, should have thanked her again, should have let her go. Instead, he found himself following her out of the coach, Samuel warm against his shoulder, his heart pounding with something that felt dangerously like desperation. The street was busy with the evening traffic of a growing town, cowboys heading toward the saloons, shop owners closing up for the night, families finishing their suppers. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The smell of wood smoke and cooking meat drifted on the cool evening air. Eliza stood on the wooden sidewalk, her bag in hand, looking small and lost in the gathering darkness. Mrs. Moore, Caleb said, and she turned to face him. I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out before you answer. Her expression became guarded. Mr. Warren, if you're planning to offer money, please don't. I didn't do what I did for payment. I did it because I know why you did it, Caleb interrupted gently, and I'm not trying to insult you. But I need you to understand something. He adjusted Samuel in his arms, buying himself a moment to find the right words. The wet nurse I was hoping to hire here in Fort Collins, I got a telegram 2 days before I left Denver. She moved to Cheyenne to be near her daughter. There isn't another one within 50 miles. Eliza's face paled slightly. Surely there must be someone. A woman with a young baby. Someone who could, maybe, probably even. But finding her will take time, and convincing her will take more time. And in the meanwhile, he looked down at Samuel, whose eyes were starting to close again, heavy with milk-drunk satisfaction. In the meanwhile, my son will be right back where he was this morning, starving, and I can't... Mrs. Moore, I cannot watch him die. I can't. What are you asking me? Caleb took a breath. This was it. The moment that would either save his son or make him sound like a madman. Come to my ranch, just for a few weeks, maybe a month. Give me time to find a proper wet nurse, someone permanent. I'll pay you fair wages, more than fair. You'll have your own room, complete privacy, no obligations beyond feeding Samuel when he needs it. And when I've found someone else, I'll personally escort you to Denver and make sure you get to your position safely. Eliza stared at him, her mouth slightly open, shock written clearly across her face. You want me to come live at your ranch? With you? A man I met 3 days ago? I know how it sounds. It sounds insane, she said, but there was no heat in her voice, just disbelief. Mr. Warren, I appreciate that you're in a difficult position, but you cannot possibly think that's an appropriate arrangement. What would people say? What would they think? I don't give a damn what people think, Caleb said, and was surprised by the vehemence in his own voice. My son is alive right now because of you. In all likelihood, he'd be dead if you hadn't done what you did on that coach. So no, I don't care about propriety or appearances or what the church ladies might whisper. I care about keeping Samuel alive. You have a housekeeper, you said. She can help with... She's 68 years old and has arthritis so bad she can barely hold a teacup, Caleb said. She's been with my family since I was a boy, and I wouldn't trade her for anything, but she can't feed an infant. You can. Eliza turned away, one hand pressed to her mouth. Caleb could see her shoulders shaking slightly, could see the war playing out in her posture, duty pulling one way, grief pulling another, need pulling a third direction entirely. I have a job waiting in Denver, she said quietly. A good job, respectable. I gave them my word I'd be there by the 1st of the month. I'll write to them. I'll explain the situation, ask them to hold the position. If they won't, I'll find you a better one. You can't promise that. I can try. She turned back to face him, and in the lamplight spilling from the nearest shop window, He could see tears on her cheeks. Why me? You don't know anything about me. I could be anyone. I could be a criminal, a drunk, You're a mother who lost her child, Caleb said simply, and you just saved mine. That's all I need to know. For a long moment, they stood there in the cooling evening air, the sounds of Fort Collins flowing around them. Laughter from a nearby saloon, the distant ringing of a blacksmith's hammer, a woman calling her children in for the night. Samuel made a soft cooing sound, and Eliza's eyes were drawn to him immediately, her expression softening despite herself. 1 month, Caleb pressed. That's all I'm asking. Give me 1 month to find another solution. If I can't, we'll figure something else out. But please, Mrs. Moore, please don't get on that stage tomorrow. Eliza closed her eyes, and Caleb held his breath, watching her face. He was asking too much, he knew. Asking a grieving widow to step into a situation that could ruin her reputation. Asking her to feed another woman's child. Asking her to open wounds that were clearly still raw and bleeding. But he was also offering her something, wasn't he? A purpose, a reason to wake up in the morning. A baby who needed her in the most fundamental way a child could need a woman. When Eliza opened her eyes, she looked directly at Samuel, not at Caleb. What was your wife's name? She asked. Margaret. Margaret Ann Warren. And she knew? Before she died? She knew Samuel would need someone? Caleb's throat tightened. She made me promise to keep him safe. To find a way, whatever it took. Those were her last words. Eliza reached out slowly, hesitantly, and touched Samuel's cheek with one finger. The baby turned toward the touch instinctively, and she made a small, pained sound. My daughter's name was Rose, she whispered. Rose Elizabeth Moore. She had dark hair like her father, but my eyes, gray-blue, like storm clouds. Her finger traced the curve of Samuel's tiny ear. She was perfect, so perfect, and I couldn't save her. I'm sorry, Caleb said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Fever took her. It came on so fast, and nothing I did made any difference. I tried everything, cool cloths, warm baths, every remedy anyone suggested, but she just got weaker and weaker, and then one morning Eliza's voice broke. She withdrew her hand and wrapped both arms around herself. I held her for hours afterward. I couldn't let go. My husband had to pry her out of my arms. Your husband died 2 weeks later. Influenza. Eliza's laugh was bitter, hollow. So I buried them both and sold everything we owned because I couldn't stand to be in that house for one more second. I bought a ticket to Denver because it was far away and I didn't know anyone there, and I thought maybe if I went somewhere where no one knew about Rose, I could pretend to be someone who hadn't lost everything. Caleb wanted to say something, anything, that would ease the raw agony in her words. But what comfort could he offer? He understood her grief too well, the suffocating weight of it, the way it colored everything, the desperate need to escape while knowing escape was impossible. I can't promise this won't hurt, he said finally. Feeding Samuel, caring for him while you're still mourning Rose. It might make everything worse. Or it might make it bearable, Eliza countered softly. For a little while at least, to be needed again, to matter to someone. You'd matter to him, to us. She looked at Caleb then, really looked at him, and he felt the intensity of that gaze like a physical thing. She was measuring him, he realized, trying to determine if he was trustworthy, if his desperation was making him dangerous, if stepping into his world would save her or destroy her. 1 month, she said finally. Relief flooded through Caleb so intensely he actually swayed. 1 month, he agreed quickly. Maybe less if I can find someone sooner. And you'll write to the dress shop in Denver, explain the situation. First thing tomorrow. And I'll have my own room, my own space. This arrangement is purely practical. Do you understand? Completely, Caleb said. Mrs. Moore, I'm not looking for anything beyond what you're willing to give. This is about Samuel, nothing more. She nodded slowly, though something flickered in her expression. Relief, maybe, or possibly disappointment. It was hard to tell. Then I suppose we have an agreement. Thank you, Caleb breathed. You have no idea what this means. I have some idea, Eliza said quietly. She looked down at her traveling bag, then back up at him. I assume we're not leaving for your ranch tonight? No, it's a 2-hour ride and the road isn't safe after dark. I've got rooms at the Colorado House. I'll get one for you as well, if that's acceptable. That's fine. They walked the 3 blocks to the hotel in silence, Caleb carrying Samuel in their bags, Eliza walking beside him with her arms wrapped around herself as if she were cold, though the evening was mild. The Colorado House was a 3-story building on the corner of Linden and Walnut, respectable but not fancy, clean but well-worn from the constant traffic of miners, ranchers, and travelers. The clerk at the desk was a young man with pomaded hair and an eager smile that faltered slightly when he saw Eliza. Caleb could practically see the questions forming in his mind. Who was this woman? What was her relationship to Caleb Warren? Why were they checking in together? 2 rooms, Caleb said firmly, cutting off any speculation. Best you've got. And send up a basin of warm water and some clean cloths to mine. The baby needs a bath. Of course, Mr. Warren, right away. The clerk's professionalism snapped back into place, and he turned to retrieve keys from the board behind him. Rooms 7 and 9 are available. Both on the 2nd floor, nice and quiet. Perfect. The clerk handed over the keys, his gaze sliding to Eliza and away again quickly. Will you be wanting supper sent up? Kitchen's still open for another hour. Caleb looked at Eliza questioningly. She hesitated, then nodded. Please. Something simple. For both rooms? Yes, Caleb confirmed. And milk. Fresh, if you've got it. Still warm from the cow. The clerk made a note. I'll have it brought up within the half hour. The rooms were across the hall from each other, small but clean, each with a bed, a washstand, and a single chair by the window. Caleb got Eliza settled in room 9 first, setting her bag on the bed and making sure the lamp was working properly. I'll bring Samuel over when he needs to feed, he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. Unless you'd rather I came to get you. Bring him to me, Eliza said. She'd removed her bonnet and was unpinning her hair, and Caleb caught a glimpse of how young she actually was beneath the weight of her grief. Early 30s at most, with fine features and hair that, when freed from its pins, fell past her shoulders in dark waves. It'll be easier that way, less conspicuous. Caleb nodded and crossed the hall to his own room, where he laid Samuel on the bed and began the process of changing the baby's diaper. His hands were steadier now than they'd been in weeks, the panic that had been his constant companion since Margaret's death finally easing its grip on his chest. Samuel watched him with those dark, serious eyes, Margaret's eyes, and Caleb felt emotion swell in his throat. Your mama would have known what to do, he told his son quietly, unfastening the soiled cloth and replacing it with a clean one. She'd have handled all of this so much better than I have, but she'd be grateful to Mrs. Moore, I think. Grateful that someone was there when I couldn't figure it out on my own. Samuel's response was a tiny yawn and a stretch of his impossibly small arms. The warm water and cloths arrived, followed shortly by their supper. Beef stew with fresh bread for Caleb, a lighter meal of chicken and vegetables for Eliza, and a bottle of milk still warm from the evening milking. Caleb bathed Samuel carefully in the basin, washing away 3 days of road dust and dried milk, marveling at how much more substantial the baby felt already. 1 day of proper feeding, and the desperate hollow look had already begun to fade from his face. He was drying Samuel and getting him into a clean nightshirt when he heard the knock on Eliza's door across the hall, followed by her soft voice thanking someone for the meal. The smell of food reminded Caleb that he hadn't eaten since breakfast, but his own supper would have to wait. Samuel was starting to make the rooting motions again, his small mouth opening and closing, his head turning from side to side in search of nourishment. Caleb wrapped him in a clean blanket and crossed the hall, knocking softly on Eliza's door. It's me, he called quietly. He's hungry again. The door opened immediately. Eliza had changed into a simpler dress, something dark and loose that was clearly meant for sleeping or informal wear. Her hair was still down, braided now in a single plait over one shoulder. Without her bonnet and traveling clothes, she looked softer somehow, more vulnerable. Come in, she said, stepping aside. Caleb entered hesitantly, acutely aware of the impropriety of being in a woman's room, even under these circumstances. Eliza seemed to sense his discomfort because she gave him a small, sad smile. Propriety went out the window on that stagecoach, Mr. Warren. I think we can manage to feed your son without worrying about scandal. Still, Caleb said, I'll turn my back, give you privacy. I'd appreciate that. He handed Samuel to her and turned to face the door while she settled into the chair by the window. He heard the rustle of fabric, Samuel's small sound of recognition, then the sudden silence as the baby began to nurse. For several minutes, the only sounds were the soft rhythmic noises of Samuel feeding and the distant sounds of Fort Collins settling in for the night. Horses moving in the street below, someone laughing in a nearby room, the creak of floorboards as other guests moved about. Mr. Warren? Eliza said finally. Yes? Why did you leave your ranch? If you don't mind my asking, you could have hired someone to go to Denver and find a wet nurse. Why make the journey yourself with a newborn? Caleb kept his eyes on the door. I needed to get out of that house. Every room, every corner, it was all Margaret. Her things, her plans for the nursery, her books still open to the pages she'd been reading. I couldn't breathe there. And Samuel was crying all the time, and I kept thinking maybe the problem was me. Maybe I was doing something wrong that a professional would know how to fix. But the wet nurse in Denver didn't work out. No, she tried, but Samuel wouldn't take to her, fought it every time. And she had other babies to care for, babies who actually wanted to feed from her. She told me I was wasting her time and mine. He paused. That's when I realized I couldn't trust this to anyone else. Whatever the solution was, I had to find it myself. And then you found me, Eliza said softly. Or you found us. I'm still not sure which. Does it matter? I suppose not. More silence, broken only by Samuel's contented sounds. Then Eliza spoke again, and her voice was thick with emotion. I prayed, you know, after Rose died. I prayed that if there was any purpose to it, any reason she had to die, that I would be able to find it, that her life wouldn't have been meaningless. Caleb turned halfway, forgetting his promise not to look, drawn by the raw pain in her words. Eliza was gazing down at Samuel, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling too, a broken, beautiful smile full of grief and gratitude. I'm sorry, Caleb said. I didn't mean to make you— Don't apologize, she said fiercely. This is the first time in 4 months I've felt like I might survive this. Like there might be a reason to keep breathing, so don't apologize for giving me that. Caleb nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He turned back to the door, giving her the privacy she deserved, and waited while she finished feeding his son. When Samuel was done, Eliza called softly for Caleb to take him. The baby was milk-drunk and sleepy, his tiny body completely relaxed. Caleb held him close, feeling the steady beat of his son's heart against his chest. Thank you, he said to Eliza. You've said that enough times today, she replied, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Save your thanks for when the month is over and Samuel has found a permanent nurse. Still, I mean it. I know. Caleb carried Samuel back to his own room and settled the baby in the middle of the bed, surrounded by pillows to keep him from rolling. His own supper had gone cold, but he ate it anyway, suddenly ravenous. The stew was mediocre, the bread a bit stale, but it was the first meal he'd been able to eat without his stomach churning with anxiety in longer than he could remember. He washed up at the basin and changed into his nightshirt, then carefully arranged himself on the bed next to Samuel. The baby was already deeply asleep, his breathing soft and even, his small face peaceful in the lamplight. Caleb watched him for a long time. This tiny person who had already changed his life in ways he couldn't have imagined 3 weeks ago. He thought about Margaret, about the future they'd planned that would never come to pass. He thought about Eliza across the hall, crying while she fed another woman's child, finding purpose in an act that must have reopened every wound. And he thought about tomorrow, when they'd ride out to the ranch and begin this strange, necessary arrangement that broke every rule of propriety but might just save all 3 of them. Outside, the night deepened. Fort Collins grew quiet. And in room 7 of the Colorado house, a man and his infant son slept peacefully for the first time since the world had shattered around them. Across the hall, Eliza Moore sat by her window, looking out at the stars scattered across the Colorado sky, and allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, that she might have something to offer the world beyond her grief. That maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward after all, even if it looked nothing like the one she'd planned. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky pink when Caleb loaded the last of their bags into the wagon. Samuel was bundled in Eliza's arms, awake and alert, but blessedly quiet, his dark eyes taking in the unfamiliar sights of Fort Collins stirring to life. Shopkeepers were sweeping their stoops, a milk wagon rattled past, and somewhere nearby a rooster crowed with enthusiastic persistence. Eliza stood on the hotel steps watching Caleb work, her traveling cloak pulled tight against the morning chill. She'd slept poorly, waking every hour convinced she'd made a terrible mistake. That climbing into a wagon with a stranger and riding out to his isolated ranch was the kind of decision desperate people made right before their lives fell apart completely. But then she'd hear Samuel's soft cries through the wall, followed by Caleb's low voice trying to soothe him, and she'd remember why she'd agreed to this madness in the first place. The baby needed her, and she needed to be needed. "Ready?" Caleb asked, offering his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. Eliza took his hand, noting the calluses and the strength in his grip as he steadied her. She settled onto the bench with Samuel cradled against her chest, arranging her skirts to make room for Caleb beside her. "It's about 2 hours to the ranch," he said, taking up the reins. "Road's decent this time of year, but it gets rough in places. Let me know if you need to stop." "I'll be fine." They rolled out of Fort Collins as the town woke fully around them, past the last scattered houses and into open country. The landscape here was different from the endless plains they'd crossed on the stagecoach, more varied, with rolling hills and clusters of pine trees, the Rocky Mountains rising in the distance like a serrated blue wall against the western sky. The air smelled of sage and grass, and the clean, thin quality that came with altitude. For the first hour, they rode in comfortable silence. Samuel dozed in Eliza's arms, waking occasionally to make small sounds before drifting off again. The wagon's rhythm was soothing, and despite her restless night, Eliza found herself relaxing incrementally, her shoulders dropping, her breathing deepening. "Tell me about your ranch," she said finally, needing to break the silence before her own thoughts grew too loud. Caleb kept his eyes on the road, but she saw a flicker of something cross his face. Pride, maybe. "It's called the Double W. Been in my family since my father staked the claim in '59. Started with nothing but a tent and 24 head of cattle. Now it's over 3,000 acres with nearly 500 head. That's impressive. My father built it. I just kept it running after he passed." Caleb shifted the reins to one hand, using the other to point toward a line of trees in the distance. "Creek runs through the property year-round. Good water, good grazing. We winter the cattle in the lower pastures and move them up to summer range come May." "How many people work for you?" 6 full-time hands, 2 seasonal workers during roundup and branding. There's a bunkhouse for them, separate from the main house. They keep to themselves mostly, especially after Margaret." He trailed off, his jaw tightening. Eliza waited, letting the silence stretch until he was ready to continue. "After she died, I told them to stay clear of the house, unless there was an emergency. I couldn't handle their sympathy, their awkward condolences, and with Samuel crying all the time, I just wanted to be left alone to figure it out." "And your housekeeper?" "Ruth. She'll be surprised to see you, but she'll be kind about it. She's been after me for weeks to find help with Samuel." Caleb glanced at Eliza, his expression uncertain. "I should probably warn you that people will talk. A widow living at a widower's ranch, no matter how proper the arrangement. Fort Collins isn't Denver. Word spreads fast out here." "Let them talk," Eliza said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I've spent the last 4 months worried about what people think, trying to be the grieving widow everyone expected me to be. Wearing black, speaking softly, accepting casseroles and sympathy with a smile. I'm tired of it, Mr. Warren. If people want to gossip, that's their concern, not mine." A slow smile spread across Caleb's face, the first genuine one she'd seen from him. "You might fit in better out here than you think, Mrs. Moore." They crested a rise, and suddenly the ranch spread out before them in a shallow valley. A sturdy 2-story house with a wide porch, a large barn painted red, several outbuildings, and fenced pastures where cattle grazed in the morning sun. It was beautiful in a practical, working kind of way, clearly built to last through harsh winters and hotter summers. "Home," Caleb said simply. As they approached, Eliza could see a woman emerge from the house onto the porch, shading her eyes against the sun. Ruth, she assumed. Even from a distance, Eliza could see her surprise when she spotted the second passenger in the wagon. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house, and Ruth descended the porch steps with careful movements that spoke to the arthritis he'd mentioned. She was small and spare, with white hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that missed nothing. "Caleb Warren, you'd better have a good explanation for bringing a lady home unannounced," she said, but there was no real heat in her voice. Her gaze had already found Samuel in Eliza's arms, and her expression softened immediately. "Lord have mercy, is that baby actually sleeping peacefully?" "Ruth, this is Mrs. Eliza Moore," Caleb said, climbing down from the wagon and moving around to help Eliza descend. "She's going to be staying with us for a while, helping with Samuel." Ruth's sharp eyes moved from the baby to Eliza's face, then down to where Eliza held Samuel with a practiced ease that spoke volumes. Understanding dawned in the older woman's expression, followed by something that looked like relief. "Well," she said. "Well, well. Come inside, Mrs. Moore. Let's get you settled." The house was exactly what Eliza had expected, functional and comfortable, with sturdy furniture and minimal decoration. But she could see Margaret's touches everywhere. The embroidered pillows on the sofa, the carefully arranged books on the shelves, the watercolor paintings of wildflowers on the walls. A woman had made this house a home, and her absence was palpable in the layer of dust on the mantel, the wilting flowers in a vase by the window, the general air of abandonment that came when grief stopped caring about details. Ruth showed Eliza to a bedroom on the second floor, a pleasant room with windows facing east and south, filled with morning light. The bed was already made with clean linens, and there was a rocking chair in the corner that looked handcrafted and well-used. "This was the guest room," Ruth said, moving to open the windows and let in fresh air. "Hasn't been used in over a year, but I aired it out this morning after Caleb sent word from town that he was bringing someone. Bathroom's down the hall, shared with the other bedrooms, but you'll have privacy. Caleb's room is on the other end of the hall and the nursery is between." "Thank you," Eliza said, setting her bag on the bed. Samuel was starting to fuss in her arms, making small, hungry sounds. "I should probably feed him soon." Ruth nodded knowingly. "I'll bring up some water and towels. You'll want to freshen up, I expect." She paused at the door, her expression kind but direct. "I don't know your story, Mrs. Moore, and I won't pry, but I've watched that man downstairs barely hold himself together for 3 weeks, trying to keep that baby alive on cow's milk and desperation. Whatever your reasons for being here, I'm grateful for them." After Ruth left, Eliza settled into the rocking chair and fed Samuel, looking out the window at the ranch spread below. She could see men working in the distance, could hear the sounds of cattle and horses, could smell the earthy scent of hay and manure drifting through the open window. It was so different from the small house she'd shared with her husband, from the cramped boarding house where she'd spent the last 4 months, from the city she'd been planning to make her new home. This was a working ranch, a place of constant motion and purpose. And for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, it felt less like an exile and more like a reprieve. The first week passed in a blur of routine. Eliza fell into a rhythm dictated by Samuel's needs, feeding him every 3 hours, changing him, bathing him, soothing him when he fussed. Between feedings, she helped Ruth with light household tasks, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from spiraling into the dark places it wanted to go. Caleb was gone most of each day, working the ranch with his hands, coming back to the house only for meals and to check on Samuel. He was careful around Eliza, always polite, always grateful, maintaining a distance that was both respectful and slightly awkward. They were 2 people sharing space, but not lives, connected only by the baby who needed them both. But Samuel was thriving. In just 7 days, he'd gained weight visibly, his cheeks filling out, his skin taking on a healthy pink glow. He was more alert too, his eyes tracking movement, his small hands reaching for things that caught his attention. Watching him grow stronger felt like watching a miracle unfold in slow motion. On the 8th day, Ruth found Eliza in the kitchen after breakfast, washing dishes while Samuel dozed in a basket nearby. "There's a dress in the wardrobe in your room," Ruth said, drying a plate with methodical precision. "Dark blue cotton. It was Margaret's, from before she was pregnant. I think it would fit you better than those traveling clothes you've been wearing." Eliza's hand stilled in the dishwater. "I couldn't possibly." "She'd want it used," Ruth said firmly. She wasn't the kind of woman who believed in keeping things locked away for sentiment. And you can't keep wearing the same two dresses. It's not practical. That afternoon, when Samuel was napping and Caleb was out checking fences, Eliza opened the wardrobe in her room and found the dress. It was beautiful, simple but well made, with a fitted bodice and full skirt, the kind of dress a ranch wife would wear for church or special occasions. She held it up to herself in front of the small mirror, and for just a moment she let herself imagine what it would be like to belong here, to be part of this place instead of just passing through. Then she caught herself and carefully hung the dress back up. She was here for Samuel, nothing more. 1 month, Caleb had said, maybe less. She couldn't afford to forget that. But the next Sunday, when Ruth mentioned that some of the ranch hands' families were coming for a barbecue, Eliza found herself putting on the blue dress without quite deciding to. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her, and when she came downstairs she saw Caleb freeze in the middle of the living room, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," Eliza said quickly. "Ruth said it was all right, but if it's too—" "You look lovely," Caleb said, and his voice was rough with something that might have been grief or might have been something else entirely. Margaret would be glad to see it worn again. The barbecue was awkward at first. The ranch hands and their wives were curious about Eliza, their questions polite but probing. Who was she? Where was she from? How long was she staying? Eliza deflected as best she could, offering vague answers about helping with the baby, about needing work, about temporary arrangements. But then one of the wives, a young woman named Sarah with a toddler on her hip, and another baby due any day, asked if she could hold Samuel. Eliza handed him over reluctantly, watching as Sarah cooed at the baby, as the other women gathered around to admire him. "He's beautiful," Sarah said, "and so healthy. Caleb must be doing something right." "Mrs. Moore's been helping," Caleb said from where he stood by the grill, turning steaks with careful attention. "She's made all the difference." The women's eyes swung to Eliza with new interest and understanding. She felt heat rise in her cheeks but met their gazes steadily. Let them think what they wanted. She had nothing to be ashamed of. "Well, we're just glad to see this little one thriving," one of the older wives said diplomatically. "It's been hard on all of us, watching Caleb struggle." The conversation moved on to safer topics. Weather, cattle prices, whose garden was doing best this year. But Eliza felt the weight of their assessment, the way they were measuring her against Margaret's ghost, deciding whether she was worthy of the space she occupied. As the sun set and the families began packing up to leave, Sarah approached Eliza one more time, San's toddler, who was being wrestled into a wagon by her husband. "I just wanted to say," Sarah began, her voice low so others wouldn't hear, "that what you're doing is kind. However you came to be here, whatever the arrangement is, that baby needed help, and you gave it. Some of these women will gossip, but don't let it bother you. You're doing a good thing." "Thank you," Eliza said, surprised by how much the words meant. The days continued to pass, each one blurring into the next in a way that was both comforting and disconcerting. Eliza had expected to feel like an outsider, like a temporary interloper in someone else's life. But instead, she found herself settling in, learning the rhythms of the ranch, memorizing which floorboards creaked and which windows stuck, where Ruth kept the good china, and how Caleb took his coffee. She learned other things, too, that Caleb was up every morning before dawn, no matter how late he'd been up with Samuel the night before. That he hummed when he thought no one was listening, tuneless but content. That he had a scar on his left hand from a cattle brand that had slipped when he was 16, and another on his shoulder from a fall off a horse at 22. That he read poetry sometimes, late at night, collections by Whitman and Dickinson that had belonged to Margaret. That he was lonely in a way that went deeper than grief. 3 weeks into her stay, Eliza was sitting on the porch in the evening twilight, Samuel asleep against her shoulder, when Caleb joined her. He'd bathed and changed after a long day of work, and he smelled of soap and leather and the faint tang of wood smoke. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. "It's your porch." He settled into the chair beside her with a sigh that spoke of bone-deep exhaustion. For a few minutes they sat in companionable silence, watching the last light fade from the western sky, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. "I've been making inquiries," Caleb said finally, "about a wet nurse." There's a woman in Loveland who might be willing to take on another baby. I'm supposed to meet with her next week. Something cold settled in Eliza's stomach. That's good. That's what we agreed. Yes. More silence, heavier this time. You've been here almost a month, Caleb continued. I know you must be eager to get on with your plans. Get to Denver, start your new position. I wrote to the dress shop, Eliza said. Explained the situation. They said they'd hold the position another 2 weeks, but after that, they'd need to hire someone else. I'm sorry. I know this has derailed your life. Don't be sorry. Eliza looked down at Samuel's sleeping face, at the tiny perfection of him. It's been good for me. Being useful again. Having a reason to wake up in the morning. Still, it can't be easy being away from your own plans, your own future. Eliza wanted to tell him that she'd stopped thinking of Denver as her future somewhere around the second week, that the dress shop position felt like something she'd planned in another lifetime, for a different version of herself who'd believed that running away from grief could actually work. But she didn't know how to say those things without revealing too much, without admitting that she'd started to feel at home here in a way that terrified her. Samuel's lucky to have you as his father, she said instead. You're trying so hard to do right by him. Margaret would be proud. Caleb's jaw tightened, and he looked away. Margaret deserved better than me. Deserved a husband who could have saved her, who could have— Don't, Eliza said sharply. Don't do that to yourself. I know what that spiral looks like, Mr. Warren. I've been living in it for 4 months. The what-ifs and the if-onlys and the endless replay of every decision, wondering if there was something different you could have done. But there wasn't. Some things are just beyond our control, and torturing yourself won't change that. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw recognition in his eyes. They were both survivors of losses they couldn't prevent, both trying to figure out how to keep living when the people they loved most were gone. How do you do it? He asked quietly. How do you keep going? Honestly, I don't know that I was before I met you and Samuel. I was just existing, going through motions. But this— She gestured at the baby in her arms, at the ranch around them. This gives me something to focus on beyond my own pain. Maybe that's selfish. Maybe I'm using Samuel to avoid dealing with losing Rose. But it's working, and for now, that's enough. Caleb nodded slowly. I don't think it's selfish. I think it's survival. They sat together as full darkness fell and stars began to appear overhead, the vast Colorado sky opening up like a cathedral. Eliza felt something shift between them, some wall coming down, some understanding being reached without words. They were partners in grief and survival, 2 broken people holding each other up through proximity and necessity. It was enough. It had to be enough. But then, on the morning of Eliza's 28th day at the ranch, everything changed. She was in the kitchen helping Ruth prepare lunch when they heard the sound of a horse approaching at speed. Caleb was out in the north pasture, so Eliza moved to the window to see who was coming. A man dismounted in the yard, tall and lean, with dark hair and a face that was achingly, devastatingly familiar. The bowl Eliza was holding slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. Thomas, she breathed. Ruth was at her side immediately. You know him? That's my husband's brother, Eliza said, her voice hollow with shock. What is he doing here? She didn't wait for an answer. She was out the door and across the porch before she could think better of it, before fear or common sense could stop her. Thomas Moore looked exactly as she remembered, handsome in a refined way that contrasted sharply with the rough-hewn cowboys who worked this land. He'd been a banker in Philadelphia, always well-dressed, always proper. Seeing him here, in his traveling suit with dust on his boots, was surreal. Eliza, he said, and his voice was full of relief and something else. Something that made her stomach clench. Thank goodness I found you. I've been searching for weeks. How did you— I went to Denver. The dress shop had your letter. Mentioned you were delayed at a ranch outside Fort Collins. It took some asking around, but here you are. He stepped forward, reaching for her hands. Eliza, I have so much to tell you. So much has changed. She let him take her hands, too shocked to pull away. Thomas, what are you doing here? What's happened? I've left Philadelphia, he said, and now she could hear the excitement in his voice. The bank offered me a position managing their new branch in San Francisco. It's everything I've ever wanted. a chance to start fresh, to build something new, and I want you to come with me." Eliza stared at him. "What?" "Marry me, Eliza. I know it hasn't been long since my brother passed, but we've known each other for years. We get along well. And you shouldn't be alone, living in boarding houses, working in dress shops. Come to San Francisco with me. Be my wife. We can start over together." The world seemed to tilt sideways. This was Thomas, her brother-in-law, who'd been kind to her at the funeral, who'd helped her settle her husband's affairs, who'd written her a letter of recommendation for the Denver position. This was a good man offering her exactly what she'd thought she wanted 4 months ago: security, respectability, a future. So why did it feel wrong? "I need time to think," she said. "Of course. I'm staying at the hotel in Fort Collins. I can come back tomorrow, and we can talk properly." He squeezed her hands gently. "I know this is sudden, but Eliza, we could be happy. I truly believe that." He left before she could formulate a response, mounting his horse and riding back toward town with promises to return. Eliza stood in the yard watching him go, her mind spinning. When she finally turned back to the house, she found Ruth on the porch, holding Samuel, her expression carefully neutral. "Well," the older woman said, "that's a complication." Eliza climbed the steps slowly, taking Samuel into her arms automatically. The baby cooed at her, reaching for her face with small, uncoordinated hands. "He wants me to marry him," she said. "Move to San Francisco, start over." "And what do you want?" That was the question, wasn't it? What did she want? A month ago, she would have said she wanted to escape her grief, to build a new life somewhere no one knew her story. Thomas's offer was exactly that: a clean slate, a respectable marriage, financial security. But that was before she'd fed Samuel in a stagecoach while strangers looked away in scandal, before she'd spent weeks learning the rhythms of this ranch, finding purpose in the weight of a baby in her arms, discovering that maybe grief could coexist with moments of unexpected peace, before she'd started to feel like she belonged somewhere again. "I don't know," Eliza whispered, looking down at Samuel's perfect face. "I honestly don't know." Ruth took Samuel from Eliza's arms without asking, her weathered hands steady and sure. "You're shaking," she said simply. "Go sit down before you fall down." Eliza let herself be guided into the house, into the kitchen where the shattered bowl still lay in pieces on the floor. She sank into a chair at the table while Ruth settled Samuel into his basket, then set about sweeping up the broken ceramic with practiced efficiency. "How long were you married to his brother?" Ruth asked, her tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than a proposal that had just upended everything. 4 years. We met when I was 24, married 6 months later." "Did you love him?" The question was so direct it startled Eliza into honesty. "I thought I did. He was kind, stable, everything my mother said I should want in a husband, and after we married I grew to care for him deeply. But love?" She paused, searching for the right words. "I don't know if I ever really understood what that meant until Rose was born. Then I loved someone so completely it terrified me." Ruth dumped the ceramic shards into the waste bin and put the broom away. "And the brother? Thomas? He was always kind to me. After my husband died, he helped with everything: the funeral arrangements, selling the house, settling debts. He wrote me that letter of recommendation for Denver without my even asking. But you never thought of him as anything more than family." "No, never." Ruth sat down across from Eliza, her sharp eyes assessing. "So this proposal comes out of nowhere. A man you haven't seen in 4 months suddenly rides out here asking you to marry him and move across the country. He said he has a position in San Francisco, that we could start fresh together." "Starting fresh," Ruth repeated, and there was something knowing in her tone. "That what you want, Mrs. Moore? To run away from your grief by pretending to be someone else somewhere else?" Eliza opened her mouth to defend herself, then closed it. Because wasn't that exactly what she'd been planning 4 months ago when she bought that ticket to Denver? To reinvent herself in a place where no one knew about Rose, where she could pretend to be a woman who hadn't lost everything? "I don't know what I want anymore," she admitted. "That's a start," Ruth said. "At least you're being honest about it." The sound of boots on the porch announced Caleb's return. He came through the door, still dusty from work, pulling off his hat, his face lighting up when he saw Samuel awake and content in his basket. Then he noticed Eliza's expression, and concern replaced the momentary joy. "What's wrong? Is Samuel all right?" "Samuel's fine," Ruth said before Eliza could answer. But Mrs. Moore had a visitor. Her brother-in-law came calling from Philadelphia. Caleb's eyes moved to Eliza, searching her face. "Is everything all right? Your family? Everyone's fine," Eliza said quickly. "He came because—" She faltered, unsure how to explain, what words to use. "He has a position in San Francisco, a bank manager, and he asked me to marry him and go with him." The silence that followed was deafening. Caleb stood frozen in the doorway, his hat crushed in his hands, his face carefully blank, in the way people's faces went blank when they were trying not to show emotion. "I see," he said finally. That's quite an opportunity." "Is it?" Eliza asked, surprised by the sharpness in her own voice. "Financial security, respectability, a fresh start in a new city. That's what you wanted, isn't it, when you bought that ticket to Denver?" "I thought it was." "And now?" Eliza stood abruptly, needing to move, needing to do something with the nervous energy coursing through her. "Now I don't know. He's coming back tomorrow for my answer, and I have no idea what to tell him." Caleb set his hat on the hook by the door with deliberate care. "Do you love him?" "No." "Does he love you?" "I don't think so. I think he's lonely, and I'm familiar, and he wants to do the honorable thing by his brother's widow." "And would that be enough for you?" Caleb's voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it, something raw and urgent that made Eliza's heart beat faster. A marriage of convenience? Companionship without passion? "I had passion once," Eliza said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't quite true. "With my husband, with Rose. And it destroyed me when I lost them. Maybe convenience would be safer." "Safer," Caleb repeated, and now there was definitely something in his voice, anger maybe, or frustration. "You want to spend the rest of your life playing it safe? Don't I deserve safety after everything I've lost? You deserve happiness. You deserve to build a life instead of hiding from one." Eliza turned to face him fully, her own frustration rising to meet his. "And what would you know about building a life, Mr. Warren? You've spent the last month barely holding yourself together, hiding out here on your ranch, keeping everyone at arm's length except when you absolutely need them." The words were cruel, and she regretted them the instant they left her mouth. But Caleb didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. "You're right," he said. "I have been hiding. But you've been doing the same thing, pretending that feeding my son is somehow filling the hole Rose left. Using this place, using me, using Samuel to avoid facing the fact that your life has to continue even though she's gone. That's not fair, isn't it? You want to talk about running away? You've been running since the day she died. First to boarding houses, then to Denver, and now Thomas is offering you a new place to run to. When do you stop running, Eliza? When do you stand still long enough to actually heal?" The use of her first name shocked them both. For a month they'd maintained careful formality. Mr. Warren, Mrs. Moore, a wall of propriety between them. But now that wall had cracked and something raw and real was bleeding through. Ruth cleared her throat loudly. "I think I'll take Samuel upstairs for his nap," she said, gathering the baby in his basket. "You two clearly need to have a conversation without an audience." She left before either of them could protest, her footsteps creaking on the stairs, then the soft click of a door closing overhead. Eliza and Caleb stood in the kitchen, 3 feet of space between them that felt both too much and not enough. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere outside, a horse whinnied, and one of the hands called out to another. "I'm sorry," Caleb said finally. "I had no right to say those things. Your life, your choices, they're yours to make." "You weren't wrong, though," Eliza said quietly. "I have been running, and maybe I am using Samuel, using this place to avoid dealing with my grief. But Caleb," she used his first name deliberately, claiming the intimacy he'd established. "For the first time in 4 months, I felt like I might actually survive this. Is that so wrong?" "No," he said. "It's not wrong. But is surviving enough? Or do you want more than that?" What more is there? He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, close enough now that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could smell the scent of horses and leather and honest work that clung to him. "There's this," he said. "This thing between us that we've both been pretending doesn't exist. This connection that has nothing to do with Samuel and everything to do with 2 people who understand each other's pain." Eliza's breath caught. "Caleb, I'm not asking you to love me," he continued, his voice low and intense. "I'm not even asking you to stay. But don't leave because it's easier. Don't marry Thomas because he's offering you an escape. If you go, go because you want to, because San Francisco is where your heart leads you, not because you're too scared to face what's here." "And what's here?" she whispered. "Honestly, I don't know. But I'd like the chance to find out. Not in a month, not in some predetermined timeline, but for as long as it takes, you and me and Samuel, figuring out how to build something real from all this brokenness. That's not what we agreed to. I know. And if you want to hold me to our original agreement, I'll respect that. I'll take you to Denver tomorrow, write you a glowing reference, and let you go. But Eliza, I'm asking you not to make me do that." Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Why?" "Because I need you," he said simply. "Not just for Samuel, though that's how this started. I need you because you're the only person who looks at me and sees past the grief. Because you make me laugh sometimes without meaning to. Because you wear Margaret's dresses and somehow it doesn't hurt the way I thought it would. It feels right, like you're supposed to be here wearing them. I can't replace her. I'm not asking you to. Margaret was my wife and I loved her, and that will never change. But she's gone, and I'm still here, and so are you. And maybe we could find something together that isn't about replacing what we lost, but about building something new from what remains." Eliza wanted to argue, to point out all the reasons this was impossible, all the ways it could go wrong. But instead, she found herself thinking about the past month, the quiet evenings on the porch, the shared meals, the way Caleb's eyes softened when he held Samuel, the unexpected moments of laughter over some small thing Ruth had said or Samuel had done. She thought about Thomas's proposal, about San Francisco, about the life of respectable convenience he was offering. It was safe, predictable, everything she'd thought she wanted. And she realized with sudden, startling clarity that she didn't want it at all. "I need time," she said. "I need to think about this without you standing here looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I'm something precious that might break." A small smile tugged at his mouth. "You are something precious, and you're going to break if you keep pretending you're made of stone," says the man who spent 3 weeks barely speaking to anyone. "Exactly. I'm an expert on what not to do." Despite everything, Eliza felt a laugh escape her throat. It surprised them both, that small sound of genuine amusement in the middle of such a serious conversation. "Go," Caleb said gently. "Think. Take all the time you need, but know that whatever you decide, I'll support you, even if it means losing you." He left then, heading back out to whatever work awaited him, leaving Eliza alone in the kitchen with her thoughts spinning like leaves in a windstorm. That night, after Samuel was fed and sleeping, after Ruth had retired to her small room off the kitchen, Eliza sat in the rocking chair by her window and forced herself to be brutally honest. She'd married her first husband because it was expected, because he was suitable, because her mother had approved. And she'd made it work, had built a life with him that was comfortable, if not passionate. When Rose was born, she'd finally understood what it meant to love completely, without reservation. And when Rose died, that love had nearly killed her. Thomas was offering her safety from that kind of pain. A marriage based on mutual respect and shared history, nothing deep enough to devastate her if it ended. She could live her whole life never feeling that crushing grief again. But she'd also never feel joy the way she'd felt it these past weeks, watching Samuel grow stronger, learning the rhythms of this ranch, discovering that she could laugh again, could feel the sun on her face and appreciate its warmth instead of resenting it for daring to shine when her daughter was dead. The truth was, she'd already made her choice. She just hadn't admitted it to herself yet. When Thomas returned the following afternoon, Eliza met him on the porch, alone. Caleb had made himself scarce, taking Samuel into town on some invented errand, giving her privacy for this conversation. Thomas looked hopeful as he dismounted, his smile confident in the way of men who'd never really been refused anything. "Have you thought about my proposal?" he asked, climbing the porch steps. "I have," Eliza said, "and I'm honored, Thomas. Truly. You're a good man, and you'd make someone a fine husband." His smile faltered slightly. "But not you. Not me." He was quiet for a moment, processing the rejection. "May I ask why? Is it too soon after my brother's death? Because I can wait if that's—" "It's not the timing," Eliza said gently. "It's that I don't love you, and you don't love me. We'd be settling, both of us, and I've realized that I don't want to settle anymore." "What will you do? Stay here, feeding another woman's child?" There was judgment in his voice now, a hint of the social disapproval she'd been expecting all along. Eliza straightened her spine, meeting his gaze directly. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what I'm going to do. For as long as Samuel needs me, for as long as I choose to stay. Not because I'm running from my grief, but because I'm choosing to live with it in a way that feels honest. People will talk, Eliza. A widow living at a widower's ranch, it's not proper. Then let them talk," she said, echoing the words she'd spoken to Caleb a month ago. "I'm tired of living my life according to what other people think is proper. My daughter is dead, Thomas. Nothing about my life is proper anymore. But it's mine, and I get to decide what I do with it." Thomas studied her for a long moment, and she saw the exact instant he accepted defeat. His shoulders dropped slightly, and he nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Then I wish you well, Mrs. Moore. Truly. And I wish you the same. You'll find someone in San Francisco, someone who can love you the way you deserve." He left without further argument, mounting his horse and riding away with the same confidence he'd arrived with, just redirected toward a different future. Eliza watched him go and felt nothing but relief. When Caleb returned an hour later with Samuel fussing in his arms, he found Eliza in the kitchen helping Ruth prepare supper. "He's hungry," Caleb said, stating the obvious. "Then I'll feed him," Eliza replied, wiping her hands on her apron and reaching for the baby. "And Thomas?" "Gone. Back to Philadelphia first, then on to San Francisco." Caleb's face remained carefully neutral. "And you?" Eliza settled into the rocking chair by the stove, Samuel already rooting eagerly against her. "I'm exactly where I want to be." She saw the tension drain from Caleb's shoulders, saw something that looked like hope kindle in his eyes. But he didn't push, didn't ask for clarification or promises. He just nodded and went to wash up for supper, leaving Eliza and Ruth exchanging a knowing glance. "That was quite a choice you made," Ruth said, peeling potatoes with steady hands. "It was the only choice that made sense," Eliza replied. "And when people start talking, when the gossip gets ugly, then we'll deal with it, together." The word hung in the air, full of implication and promise. Together. Not temporarily, not until they found another solution, but together as a conscious choice, a deliberate building of something new. That evening, after supper was cleared and Samuel was bathed and fed and sleeping peacefully in his cradle, Eliza and Caleb found themselves on the porch again, watching the sun set over the mountains. "I meant what I said yesterday," Caleb said quietly. "I'm not asking you to replace Margaret. I'm not even asking you to love me." "What are you asking then?" "For time, for honesty, for a chance to see what we could build if we stopped being so afraid of being hurt again." Eliza thought about that, about the invitation implicit in his words. Not a proposal, not a promise, but an opening. A door left ajar, waiting to see if she'd walk through. "I can't promise I'll be easy," she said. "I have bad days, days where the grief is so heavy I can barely breathe. Days where I see Rose and everything and nothing feels worth the effort." "I know," Caleb said. "I have those days too. And I still miss her. I'll always miss her. I'll always miss Margaret." They sat with that truth between them, two people carrying losses that would never fully heal, choosing to carry them together instead of separately. "I'm staying," Eliza said, making it official. "Not for a month, not until you find someone else. I'm staying because I choose to be here." Caleb reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, his grip strong and warm and real. "Thank you," he said simply. They sat like that as the stars came out, hands linked, futures uncertain but no longer quite so frightening. Inside the house, Samuel slept, his breathing soft and even. Ruth moved about the kitchen, banking the fire for the night. And Eliza felt something she hadn't felt since Rose died, the quiet, cautious stirring of hope. Not hope that the pain would go away, or that she'd forget her daughter, or that life would ever be what it was before, but hope that maybe, just maybe, she could build something worth living for from the broken pieces of who she used to be. The ranch settled into nighttime rhythms around them. Cattle lowed in distant pastures. A coyote called from somewhere in the hills. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods. And two grieving people sat together in the darkness, holding hands, choosing life over safety, connection over isolation, the terrifying possibility of joy over the numbing certainty of mere survival. It wasn't a happy ending. It was barely even a beginning, but it was honest and it was real, and for now, that was enough. The gossip started exactly 3 days after Thomas left. Sarah, the young ranch wife who'd been kind at the barbecue, rode out to the ranch on a Tuesday morning with her toddler bouncing on the saddle in front of her. She found Eliza hanging laundry on the line behind the house, Samuel sleeping in a basket in the shade nearby. "I thought you should know," Sarah said without preamble, dismounting carefully and setting her son down to toddle after a grasshopper. "Mrs. Henderson from the Stagecoach has been talking. She's telling everyone in Fort Collins that you're living here improperly, that there's no chaperone, that you're—" She paused, her cheeks coloring. "Well, she's implying things that aren't true." Eliza pinned another of Samuel's tiny gowns to the line, her movement steady despite the anger rising in her chest. "Let her talk. We know the truth." "But it's spreading. Some of the church ladies are saying Caleb should be ashamed, that you're taking advantage of his grief. And others are saying that you're trying to trap him into marriage by making yourself indispensable with the baby." "And what do you think?" Eliza asked, turning to face Sarah directly. The younger woman met her gaze without flinching. "I think Samuel was dying and you saved him. I think whatever arrangement you and Caleb have made is between the two of you and nobody else. But Eliza," she used her first name with tentative familiarity, "you need to be prepared. This kind of talk can get ugly, especially if you're planning to stay." "I am planning to stay." "Then you need to decide how much you care about what they think." After Sarah left, Eliza found Caleb in the barn, repairing a broken stall door. She told him about the conversation, about Mrs. Henderson's gossip, about the speculation spreading through Fort Collins like wildfire. He set down his hammer and looked at her with an expression that was part frustration, part resignation. "I was afraid of this. Small towns have long memories and sharp tongues." "Does it bother you, what they're saying?" "It bothers me that they're talking about you like you're some kind of opportunist when you've done nothing but help us. But what they think of me." He shrugged. "I stopped caring about that when Margaret died, and half of them avoided me because they didn't know what to say." Sarah said it could get ugly. "It might. Are you having second thoughts?" Eliza considered the question seriously. Was she? The easy path would be to leave, to catch a stage to Denver, or even write to Thomas and accept his offer after all. But the thought of leaving Samuel, of walking away from this place, and the fragile sense of belonging she'd found here made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with grief. "No," she said firmly. "No second thoughts. But I think we need to be clear about what this is, what we're building, not just between us, but to everyone else." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we stop hiding. Stop pretending this is some temporary arrangement that'll end any day now. If people are going to talk anyway, let's give them something real to talk about." Caleb studied her face, and she saw understanding dawn in his eyes. "You want to make this official." "I want to make it honest," Eliza corrected. "I'm not asking for promises we're not ready to make. But I am saying that I'm part of this family now, whether it's conventional or not. Samuel needs me, and I need him. And you—" She paused, gathering her courage. "You and I are building something, Caleb. It's messy and complicated and nothing like what either of us planned, but it's real. So let's stop apologizing for it." A slow smile spread across his face, the kind that reached his eyes and made him look years younger. "You know what Margaret would have said about all this?" "What?" She'd have said that anyone scandalized by a baby being properly fed needs to examine their priorities. She had no patience for false propriety. I wish I could have known her. She would have liked you, Caleb said softly. You're both stubborn as hell and twice as brave as you think you are. That Sunday, Caleb hitched up the wagon and announced they were all going to church. Ruth's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline, but she didn't comment, just put on her best dress and helped Eliza get Samuel ready. The church in Fort Collins was a simple white structure with a tall steeple and windows that let in streams of golden morning light. When Caleb's wagon pulled up, Eliza could see heads turning, could feel the weight of curious and judgmental stares as they climbed down. Caleb offered Eliza his arm with deliberate formality, and she took it, holding Samuel against her shoulder with her free hand. They walked into that church together, heads high, and took a pew in the middle of the congregation where everyone could see them. Mrs. Henderson was 3 rows ahead, and Eliza watched the woman's back stiffen with righteous indignation. Around them, whispers rippled through the assembled worshippers like wind through wheat. But Sarah was there too, with her husband and toddler, and she caught Eliza's eye and smiled. One of the ranch hands and his wife nodded respectfully. And old Mr. Patterson, who owned the feed store in town, gave Caleb a subtle thumbs up that made Eliza want to laugh. The sermon was about forgiveness and judgment, and Eliza couldn't tell if the minister had chosen the topic deliberately or if it was simply fortuitous timing. Either way, she felt several people squirm uncomfortably as he spoke about casting stones and examining one's own heart before condemning others. After the service, as they filed out into the sunshine, Mrs. Henderson made a point of walking past without acknowledgement, but several other people stopped to greet them, to admire Samuel, to make polite conversation that was clearly their way of signaling acceptance. That took courage, Ruth said on the ride home. Coming here today, facing them all down. Or stupidity, Caleb replied, but he was smiling. Sometimes the line between the two is thinner than we think, Eliza said, and felt Ruth's approving pat on her shoulder. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm, one that felt less like waiting for something to end and more like building something that would last. Eliza stopped sleeping in the guest room and instead took over the nursery adjoining Samuel's room so she could hear him when he woke at night. It was practical, she told herself, nothing scandalous about a woman sleeping near the baby she cared for. But she knew, and Caleb knew, and probably Ruth knew too, that it was also a statement. This was her place now, in the heart of the household, not tucked away as a temporary guest. Samuel thrived under her care. By 2 months old, he was smiling at the sound of her voice, tracking her movements across a room, reaching for her with increasing coordination. He was a happy baby now, so different from the desperate, starving infant on that stagecoach that Eliza sometimes had trouble reconciling them as the same child. One evening in early autumn, when Samuel was 3 months old, Eliza and Caleb sat on the porch, as had become their habit. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the aspens on the mountainside had turned to gold. I've been thinking, Caleb said, his voice careful in the way it got when he was about to say something important, about the future, about what happens when Samuel doesn't need you quite so much. Eliza's heart clenched. Are you asking me to leave? What? No. He turned to face her, genuine surprise on his face. That's not what Eliza, I'm asking what you want beyond feeding Samuel. You've built a life here, but it's centered around him. What happens as he gets older? What do you want for yourself? The question caught her off guard. She'd been so focused on survival, on getting through each day, that she hadn't thought much about larger aspirations. I don't know, she admitted. Before Rose, I used to sew. I was good at it, made all my own clothes, took in alterations for neighbors. I thought about opening a dress shop once, but my husband said it wasn't necessary. Would you want to do that now? We could build you a workshop in one of the outbuildings, get you a good sewing machine. You could take commissions from the ladies in town. You'd do that? Eliza, I want you to have a life here that's yours, not just as Samuel's nurse, but as yourself, whatever that looks like. She felt tears prick her eyes. I might want that, a place to create things, to be useful in a different way. Then we'll make it happen. They were quiet for a moment, and then Caleb spoke again, his voice lower this time. There's something else I've been thinking about. What's that? Us. what we are to each other. Eliza's pulse quickened. We're friends, partners in raising Samuel. Are we? He shifted in his chair to face her fully. Because it feels like more than that to me. Has for a while now. Caleb, I know it's complicated. I know we're both still grieving, that neither of us planned for this. But Eliza, when I think about the future, about this ranch, about Samuel growing up, you're in every version of it I can imagine. Not as an employee or a temporary arrangement, but as someone who belongs here. Who belongs with me. She couldn't breathe. What are you saying? I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you. Not the desperate, grief-stricken love that might fade when things get easier, but real love. The kind that sees all your broken pieces and wants to help you put them back together while you help me put mine back together. I'm still in love with Rose, Eliza whispered. I'll always love her. I know, and I'll always love Margaret, but Eliza, the heart is big enough for both. We can honor what we've lost and still build something new. She stood abruptly, pacing to the porch railing, gripping it with both hands. Below, the ranch spread out in the gathering darkness, lights beginning to glow in the bunkhouse, cattle settling in for the night. This place had become home without her quite realizing when it happened. I'm terrified, she said finally, of losing someone again, of letting myself love Samuel too much, love you too much, and then having it all ripped away. Caleb came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth but not touching. I'm terrified too. Every day I wake up afraid something will happen to Samuel, that I'll lose him the way I lost Margaret. But fear isn't a reason to stop living, Eliza. It's a reason to hold on tighter to what matters. And what matters? This, us, the family we're building. It's not the family either of us planned, but it's ours. And I think, if you're honest with yourself, you love it as much as I do. She turned to look at him, this man who'd been a stranger 4 months ago and was now essential to her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. His face was shadowed in the dusk, but his eyes were clear and steady and full of something that looked like hope. I do love it, she admitted. I love Samuel like he's my own. I love this ranch and Ruth's grumbling and even the damn chickens that keep escaping their coop. And I love... She paused, terrified of the words, but more terrified of not saying them. I love you, Caleb. I tried not to, tried to keep it professional and temporary, but somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you. His smile was like sunrise, breaking across his face in waves of relief and joy. Then marry me. Not because it's proper or because it'll stop the gossip, but because we choose this. We choose each other and Samuel and whatever family we build from here. Yes, she said, and the word came out halfway between a laugh and a sob. Yes, you impossible man, yes. He kissed her then, gentle and careful, as if she were something precious that might break. And maybe she was. Maybe they both were. Two shattered people trying to build something whole from their broken pieces. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eliza rested her forehead against his. Margaret, she whispered, what would she think? She'd think I was lucky as hell, Caleb said, and she'd be right. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Sarah and her husband stood up with them, along with Ruth, who cried through the entire proceeding despite her insistence that she never cried. Samuel, now 4 months old and thriving, was held by one of the ranch hands during the brief ceremony, making cooing sounds that served as his own blessing. Mrs. Henderson was not invited, though word reached them later that she'd been scandalized by the haste of it all, convinced it proved her suspicions about impropriety. Eliza found she didn't care even a little bit. The wedding night was tender and awkward and perfect in its imperfection. They made love slowly, carefully, two people learning each other's bodies while honoring the ghosts that would always be part of their story. Afterward, lying in the bed that had been Margaret's, Eliza felt a moment of guilt. Don't, Caleb said softly, as if reading her thoughts. She's not here to be hurt by this. And if she were, she'd want me to be happy. Want us both to be happy. I hope she knows I'll honor her memory, that I'll tell Samuel about her when he's old enough to understand. I know you will. That's one of the reasons I love you. The first winter was hard. Samuel cut his first teeth and was miserable for weeks. A heavy snow in January collapsed part of the barn roof, and 2 calves were lost to wolves. Ruth caught a cold that turned into pneumonia, and for 3 terrifying weeks they thought they might lose her. But they survived it together, Caleb and Eliza and Samuel and Ruth, a patchwork family bound by choice rather than blood. And when spring came and the snow melted and new calves were born, and Ruth recovered enough to complain about everything again, Eliza realized she'd stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. She'd stopped living in fear. In the spring, Caleb made good on his promise and converted one of the outbuildings into a sewing workshop. Eliza ordered a Singer sewing machine from Denver and began taking commissions, first from the ranch wives, then from women in Fort Collins who'd heard about her skill with a needle. The work was satisfying in a way that was entirely separate from caring for Samuel. It was hers, her talent, her creativity, her contribution to the household finances. And when she held a finished dress up to the light, admiring the neat stitches and careful construction, she felt a pride that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. Samuel's first birthday came on a warm day in May. They celebrated with a small party, inviting the ranch families and a few friends from town. The baby, not quite a baby anymore, but a toddler taking wobbly steps and babbling in a language only he understood, smashed his cake with gleeful enthusiasm and got frosting in his hair. Watching him, Eliza felt her chest tighten with love so fierce it almost hurt. This child who wasn't born from her body, but was hers nonetheless. This boy who'd brought her back to life when she'd been certain she'd never feel anything but grief again. "You're thinking about her," Caleb said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Always," Eliza admitted, wondering what Rose would have looked like at this age, what kind of personality she would have had. "Does it still hurt as much?" "Differently," she said. "The sharp edges have worn down a bit. It's more like a constant ache now instead of a stabbing pain. I can breathe around it." "That's progress." "Is it? Sometimes I feel guilty that it doesn't hurt as much, like I'm forgetting her." Caleb put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You're not forgetting. You're healing. There's a difference." That night, after Samuel was asleep and the house was quiet, Eliza stood in the nursery doorway watching her son, and he was her son now, in every way that mattered, sleep peacefully in his crib. Caleb came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Taking me in, marrying me, all of it?" "Not for a single second, do you?" "No, but I think about that stagecoach sometimes, about what would have happened if I hadn't been there, or if I'd said no, or if you'd been too proud to accept help." "We'd have all lost something irreplaceable," Caleb said. "Samuel might not have survived. You'd be in San Francisco, married to Thomas, and miserable. And I'd still be alone in this house, drowning in grief. Instead, we have this. Instead, we have this." 2 years later, Eliza gave birth to a daughter. The labor was long and terrifying, bringing back memories of Rose's birth, of those perfect 6 weeks before fever stole her away. But this baby was healthy and strong, with Caleb's dark eyes and Eliza's determined chin. They named her Margaret Rose, honoring both the women who'd shaped their story. Samuel, now 3 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister, insisting on helping with everything from diaper changes to feedings. And when Eliza nursed Margaret Rose sitting in the same rocking chair where she'd first fed Samuel all those years ago, she felt the circle complete itself. She'd lost a daughter and gained a son, lost a husband and gained another. Built a family from grief and necessity and choice and love. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was a good life, an honest life. One built on the foundation of 2 people brave enough to keep trying when everything had fallen apart. 5 years after that stagecoach journey, the ranch was thriving. Samuel was 8 years old, already showing signs of Caleb's affinity for ranching, trailing after his father and asking endless questions about cattle and horses and land management. Margaret Rose was 5, precocious and wild, equally at home in Eliza's sewing workshop and out in the pastures. And there was also James, born 3 years after Margaret Rose, a quiet boy with a thoughtful nature and a gift for finding trouble wherever he went. The house was loud now, full of children's laughter and arguments and the organized chaos of a working ranch family. Ruth was still with them, older and slower but no less sharp-tongued, claiming she'd live long enough to see all these children grown if it killed her. On a warm evening in late summer, Eliza stood on the porch watching her family, Caleb teaching Samuel how to mend a fence, Margaret Rose chasing fireflies with Ruth shuffling after her, James digging in the dirt with single-minded concentration, and felt a peace she'd never thought she'd know again. The grief was still there. She still thought of Rose, still wondered who she would have become. And Caleb still spoke of Margaret sometimes, keeping her memory alive for Samuel, who had no other memory of the woman who'd given him life. But the grief no longer defined them. It was part of their story, woven into the fabric of who they were, but it wasn't the whole story. The whole story was this: two broken people who'd met on a stagecoach during the worst moments of their lives, who'd chosen courage over fear, connection over isolation, love over safety, who'd built a family not from perfection but from honesty, not from forgetting the past but from honoring it while still moving forward. Caleb climbed the porch steps and came to stand beside her, slipping his hand into hers with the easy familiarity of years together. "Happy?" he asked. Eliza thought about the question. Was she happy? There were hard days still, moments when the memories swamped her, when she looked at her children and felt the ghost of the one she'd lost. There were worries about money and weather and all the thousand uncertainties of ranch life. There were arguments and frustrations and the normal struggles of any marriage. But there was also this, children's laughter echoing across the yard, a husband who knew all her broken places and loved her anyway, work that fulfilled her, a home that felt solid and real and hers. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, I'm happy." "Good," Caleb said, kissing her temple, "because you deserve it. We all do." As the sun set over the Colorado plains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and deep purple, the family gathered on the porch. Samuel told a rambling story about a calf he'd helped birth. Margaret Rose showed off a firefly trapped carefully in her cupped hands. James fell asleep against Eliza's shoulder, dirt still under his fingernails. And Eliza thought about that desperate woman on a stagecoach holding a dying baby, making a choice that would change everything. She'd thought she was saving Samuel that day, but the truth was, he'd saved her right back. Sometimes the bravest thing you could do wasn't holding on to what you'd lost. It was stepping forward when your heart told you to, even when you were terrified, even when you had no guarantee of where the path would lead. Sometimes the family you built was stronger than the one you'd lost, not because you loved them more, but because you'd chosen them deliberately, brick by brick, moment by moment, through all the pain and fear and uncertainty. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, love found you when you least expected it. Not the easy, uncomplicated love of fairy tales, but the hard-won, battle-scarred love of people who'd survived the worst and decided to try anyway. That was the kind of love worth having, the kind worth fighting for, the kind that lasted. As the stars began to appear overhead and the ranch settled into nighttime quiet, Caleb pulled Eliza close and she leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her back. "Tell me again," he whispered, "about the stagecoach, about the moment you decided. I've told you 100 times. Tell me again anyway." So she did. The story that had become their origin myth, the tale they'd tell their children and grandchildren someday. About a baby who wouldn't stop crying, and a widow who did the unthinkable, and a cowboy who was brave enough to accept help when he needed it most. About how sometimes the end of one story was just the beginning of another. About how love, real love, could grow in the most unlikely places if you were willing to let it. The end.